Good afternoon and welcome to Everest Wagner's oration, Should Catholics Dance? As I was reflecting on this and thinking about his oration, it made me think of Fred Astaire. And Fred Astaire sang the song, "I Won't Dance, Don't Ask Me." He also sang the song, "Let's Face the Music and Dance." When Everest and the class of 2025 were freshmen, they all took a required class called Introduction to Poetic Education that has gone down in Wyoming Catholic lore as gymnopoetics. And in that class, we talked about food tasting, we told fairy tales in the dark, we read a play, and we danced. But before dancing, I had the students read two essays. One saying, basically, dance and go to hell. And the other saying, no, everybody should dance. It's the most Christian thing to do. And we would discuss this for a little while and usually come to no clear conclusion. And then the students learned to dance the Landler, which is the dance from Sound of Music, where the captain and Maria fall in love. So in a sense, we were like Fred and Ginger, who danced regardless of what the lyrics were. Everest did not forget this discussion. And he did not forget that we really never came to an exact conclusion about why one was right and one was wrong. And that's what he's chosen to look at in his thesis and oration. And I think you will enjoy it. Everett?
I would like to extend my thanks to Dr. Tonkwich for being my thesis advisor and for helping me through both the thesis and the oration, giving me critical insights in how my arguments were to flow, how I was to present, and for always being there to just give an insight into what needed to be adjusted. I'd like to thank Dr. Olson for being my second reader and for the critiques that he gave and the advice that he offered on how to make this better. And lastly, I'd like to thank Dr. Bolin for being my third panelist. Let's start with prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Our Lady, Seat of Wisdom, Saint Vitus. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I have a question for all of you. How many of you have participated in a dance? Yeah. Dancing is a pretty popular pastime, especially here at WCC. We had one just a couple of days ago for the Patronal Feast, and we typically have one every Sunday evening. And it seems like it's a pretty good, pretty fun activity, right? However, there are many who claim that when we go to dances, we commit a mortal sin and condemn our souls. So how can we reconcile this apparent conflict between what seems to be like a good activity and what these critics claim that we lose our souls every Sunday evening? To begin answering this question, we'll first look into what exactly dance is. We will then examine the biblical evidence for dancing and see what exactly it says on the morality of this. Then we will go and explore some of the arguments of those who oppose dancing. After that, we will look at some of the goods that dancing has to offer and why we as Catholics can participate in dancing. So let's start with defining what dance is. Dancing is a voluntary action. And as a voluntary action, it has a direct relation into man and how he lives. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, writes, quote, "Actions have authoritative control over what sorts of characteristics come into being," end quote. It is through action that we develop our souls in the habits of virtue and vice, and through that development, we are able to act in a virtuous or vicious manner. Since we are a combination of body and soul, we need to participate in activities that develop both the physical and the spiritual. St. Thomas Aquinas recognizes the importance of this in his Summa Theologica. Quote, "The fullness of human being requires a compound of soul and body, having all the powers and instruments of knowledge and movement. Wherefore, if any man be lacking in any of these, he is lacking in something due to the fullness of his being," end quote. If we don't develop both our physical and our spiritual sides of our nature, then we are not able to live a fully human life. One of the ways in which we develop our physical side is through recreation. Again, if we look to St. Thomas, he says, "Just as man needs bodily rest for the body's refreshment, because he cannot always be at work, since his power is finite and equal to a certain fixed amount of labor, so too is it with his soul, whose power is also finite and equal to a fixed amount of work. Now, just as weariness of the body is dispelled by resting the body, so weariness of the soul must needs be remedied by resting the soul. And the soul's rest is pleasure. This pleasure can and does come from recreation, but it must be done in accord with reason and be fitting to the circumstances in which it is sought. If it does not align with those criteria, then that pleasure and the associated action with it typically tend towards ordering one towards vice rather than towards virtue. Each action has three parts that can be corrupted. We have the object, the circumstance, and the end or the intent. The object is the action itself that is done. St. Thomas says, quote, "The primary goodness of a moral action is derived from its suitable object. What the agent does forms the foundation for doing a moral evaluation of that action. The circumstances include where and when the action is done, how it is done, to whom it is done, and the consequences that follow from it. It is by looking at the circumstances that we can determine whether a specific action is morally good or bad. Lastly, we have the end, the intent of the action. This is the motive, the why behind the action. One can do an inherently good action, but if that action is ordered towards a corrupt or immoral end, then that action faces a similar corruption. So now let's take all these parts and apply it to dancing. Dancing is a voluntary action. It is a recreational action, and as such, should bring pleasure to the soul. Its object is the motion of the dancers. This can be anything from doing a complex spin with your partner to following the basic step of the dance. The circumstances include where the dance is held, when it is held, what the participants are wearing, and the music that accompanies that dance. The end of dance is a bit multifaceted, but it should bring pleasure to the soul, help one build healthy social relationships, and perfect the body and soul through virtue. So if we put all of these pieces together, we can form a definition for it. If you flip over your quote sheet and look on the back at the bottom, you see that we can define dance as a rhythmic motion of the body in time to music for the purpose of expressing emotion and bringing pleasure to the soul. Obviously, this is a very broad definition and includes both moral and immoral kinds of dancing. So let's have a few sub-definitions here to help us keep those two separate. Moral dancing is when we have an ordered motion of the body in time to appropriate music that directs the emotions in a virtuous way and brings morally sound pleasure to the soul. Immoral dance is the opposite and is a disordered or perverted motion of the body done to improper music that inflames the passions and brings disordered pleasure to the soul. While these definitions are mostly comprehensive, they don't give us an indication on the morality of dancing. They merely show that dancing can be done well or poorly. So now let's turn to the Bible to see if it has any evidence on the moral state of dancing. The two most commonly cited biblical instances of dancing are that of King David's dance before the Ark of the Covenant and Salome's dance before King Herod in Matthew. Let's start by looking at King David. David's dance is arguably the most well-known instance of dancing in the Bible. St. Gregory the Great gives us some insight into this event, writing, quote, "When David brings back the Ark of God to Jerusalem, the power of his kingdom is not recalled to his memory. He does not fear to be of low stature in the eyes of his people by dancing. By fighting, he subdued his enemies. By dancing before the Lord, he overcame himself." David danced in humility. His joy at seeing his Lord returning to Jerusalem caused him to not only humble himself before the eyes of his people, but also before the eyes of his Creator. It was through dancing that he was able to grow in virtue. A lot of supporters of dance use this as definitive evidence that the Bible condones dancing as a morally acceptable pastime for Christians to partake in. However, the exact same argument can be used to condemn dancing as well. Salome's dance before King Herod is a perfect example of this. Saint Hilary of Poitiers gives us a description of what Salome's dance was. Quote, "On Herod's birthday, that is, amid the delights of corporeal things, the daughter of Herodias danced. With every enticing movement she made, she exuded sensual pleasure." End quote. Salome took something that could have been beautiful and perverted it, inflaming the passion and mind not only of King Herod, but also those of his guests towards immoral and lustful thoughts. This is what a lot of critics of dancing claim happens at dances, particularly modern dances where men and women dance together. They view it as this debauched activity that will corrupt the soul, and as such should not only be avoided, but outright forbidden as a spiritually dangerous activity. While the Bible does give us these two clear examples of good dancing and bad dancing, most people take these examples out of context and inappropriately apply them to situations where men and women are dancing together. In biblical times, the majority of the dancing that was done for either religious or warlike purposes and was almost entirely single-sex dancing. There's no interaction between man and woman. So these examples are not applicable to determining the morality of couples dancing together and don't really give us an indication on whether it is good or bad. So we have our definition. We've looked at some biblical evidence and found that it is not helpful. Now let's turn to two contemporary critics of couples dances, namely St. Francis de Sales and St. John Vianney, and see what their arguments are for why dancing is bad. Let's start with St. Francis de Sales. In his Introduction to the Devout Life, St. Francis writes, quote, "Dances and balls are things in themselves indifferent, but the circumstances ordinarily surrounding them have so generally an evil tendency that they become full of temptation and danger." End quote. Even with supposed good dances, St. Francis would say that the best are not worth much. Rather than wasting one's time at these activities so full of temptation, he would rather direct one to devote himself to a more worthy hobby and spend his time in service of the Lord. St. John Vianney is one of the most ferocious and most quoted critics of dancing that the church has. In a sermon that he gave to his congregation, he said, quote, "Is there any place, any time, any occasion wherein so many sins of impurity are committed as the dance halls and their sequels? Is it not at these gatherings that people are most violently prompted against the holy virtue of purity?" End quote. St. John Vianney saw dancing as one of the most nefarious tools that the devil used to seduce souls because it was such a spiritually dangerous activity that was so easy to be accepted and enjoyed even by pious people. The only product of dance that St. John Vianney saw was vice. Many modern critics will take these two saints and many others' arguments and say, well, the dancing back then was much more modest, much more virtuous, much more ordered than what is done today. And if these good dances were so scathingly condemned, then clearly the ones done today should also be condemned. However, that's not quite true. During St. Francis de Sales' life, the three most popular types of couples dancing were the pavane, the galliard, and the volta. The pavane and the galliard were both slow, decent dances that focused more on the symmetry of the partners, the footwork, and involved very little physical contact. The volta, however, was much faster and much more intimate than either of these two. Jehan Tabarot, in his Orchesography, describes how this dance is to be performed. Quote, "When you wish to turn, release the damsel's left hand and throw your left arm around her, grasping and holding her firmly by the waist above the right hip with your left hand. At the same moment, place your right hand below her bust to help her to leap when you push her forward with your left thigh. She, for her part, will place her right hand on your back or collar, with her left hand on her thigh to hold her petticoat and dress in place, lest the swirling air should catch them and reveal her bare thigh." End quote. The most scandalous part of this already very physically intimate dance involves the busk. The busk was a long, hard stiffener in the front of the woman's corset that extended a couple of inches below her waist. When the man grabbed it to help facilitate the jumping leap on the fifth beat, it looked as if you were grabbing her between the legs. This outraged the society in which it was popular and was criticized by many. One of these critics, Johann von Munster, in A Godly Treatise on the Ungodly Dance, writes, quote, "In this dance, the dancer with a leap takes the young lady and grasps her in an unseemly place. I have frequently been amazed that such a lewd and unchaste dance should be officially permitted and publicly practiced." End quote. Just because the critics claim that dancing back then was better does not necessarily make it true, and as we can see with the volta, is false. It is not a convincing argument as to why dancing is bad. Now let's take a look at the writings of St. Francis de Sales and St. John Vianney. If we go back to quote 8, you'll notice that St. Francis de Sales writes, "Dances and balls are things in themselves indifferent, but the circumstances ordinarily surrounding them have so generally an evil tendency that they become full of temptation and danger." St. Francis is not condemning dancing as inherently bad. He is condemning those dances which are done in an immoral or improper way, whether that be due poor dance styles or a licentious mindset with which one approaches that dancing. those should be avoided. But he is not condemning it as a whole. In fact, in the chapter following this quote in his introduction, he says, quote, "If you would dance or play rightly, it must be done as a recreation, not as a pursuit. The occasions on which it is right to play at questionable games are rare. Ordinary games and dances may be indulged in more frequently." It is clear that he is not banning all dancing as something morally corrupt. Now let's take a look at St. John Vianney. St. John Vianney was stationed in Ars, France in 1808 and encountered a population that was nominally Catholic at best, pagan at worst. The French Revolution in 1793 had destroyed the vast majority of any religion or morality that the people had. Ars, France, in particular, was well known for its licentious and late night dances that attracted people from miles around. Dr. Peter Kwasniewski gives us an example of what would happen at one of these gatherings. Quote, "The people of Ars did not do the stately gavotte or minuet, but the bourrier, a polka-like step which, fueled by hearty drinking, degenerated into a rustic bacchanal, after which the couples drifted off to the hedges and 9 months later saw the inevitable results." While St. John Vianney is correct in condemning these dances and their sequels, he cannot be taken as condemning dancing as a whole. The dancing that he witnessed was very corrupt and very perverted. He is writing a local response to a local problem. He is not making an infallible blanket statement that so many critics of dancing rely on to support their arguments. The important thing to remember with all of the critics of dancing is that they must be taken in the context of their time and what they would have seen performed. So we've established our definition, looked at biblical evidence, and explored these critics' arguments on why dancing is bad. But we haven't talked about why dancing is good. There are a lot of goods that dancing brings, but which we will only be able to talk about 3 due to time constraints. The first is it is a measure of cultural morality. It habituates one in virtue, and it provides a unique expression of the relationship that men and women ought to have with each other. Let's start with cultural morality. Luther Gulick is an American political scientist, and in his article, Popular Recreation and Public Morality, he says, quote, "The things we do when we do what we please are vitally related not only to health, but also to morality and the whole development of the finer self." Gulick understood that the way we recreate is the wellspring of public morality. If a society pursues virtuous, good pastimes, it is typically a good indicator that the people have a moral foundation that they are acting on and will ultimately benefit that society. On the contrary, if they pursue vicious or immoral pastimes, that typically is a sign that the moral fabric of the community has begun to rot and that ultimately that society will decay and collapse. Since dancing can be used both well and poorly, it is a very good measure of a culture's moral state. If the people dance well in accordance with the proper ends of dancing in a virtuous manner, that typically indicates that they are willing to live and act according to virtue, putting the common good and the health of their society before their own desires. If they pursue immodest or vicious forms of dancing that inflame the vices and the passions, that typically indicates that they are more concerned with pleasing and satisfying their own desires, typically at the expense of others or their society's good. So dancing, since it can be done well or poorly, provides a very good means by gauging a culture's moral state. Now let's look at how dancing habituates one in virtue. Virtue is inherently present when dancing is done well. Prudence, temperance, humility, honesty, patience, modesty, all flow from correctly done dancing. Dancers must be prudent in determining not only what they will do and how they will do it, but also how their actions will affect others at the event, either physically or spiritually. Temperance underlies this decision-making process as the dancers consider not only the comfort and skill level of their partner, but also whether or not their actions are going to be in accord with the proper ends of dance. Inexperienced dancers must be humble and honest about their skill levels when dancing with more experienced partners so they can more effectively learn and make the dance something worthy of being participated in. Experienced dancers must also practice these virtues so as to not inflate their own abilities, but also make it easier for inexperienced dancers to participate in this recreation. Pride must be set aside in order for the dance to be done well. Lastly, modesty. Modesty will naturally flow from correctly ordered dancing, from virtuous dancing, because the people at the dance will be striving to live out a virtuous life. Thus, all of their actions will be permeated by a sense of decency and decorum as they strive to dance according to that virtuous maxim that they have in them, so that way they not only act well, but dress well and speak well with each other. Now, lastly, how dance reflects the unique relationship between men and women. Men and women are designed to complement each other. This complementarity is most clearly visible in marriage, but marriage has a sacred and kind of veiled nature about it that makes it hard to see the full effect of that complementarity without damaging the unique mystery of the sacrament. Dancing provides a way in which this relationship can be manifest while still preserving marriage. When a man asks the woman to the dance floor, they become two moving as one, while still retaining each of their individual character. This is similar to marriage, where the two become one flesh while still retaining their autonomy. The man is the one who initiates the dance by asking the woman to the dance floor, and then proceeds to guide the dance, ordering their motions in time with the music and their external circumstances with the other dancers on the floor. The woman, while she does submit to the guidance of the man on the dance floor, she still has a definitive say in directing how the dance will proceed. She, first of all, will determine whether the dance will happen or not when the guy asks her. And she also will direct the energy that the man provides through the actions that they do and make them an expression of something beautiful. The man in marriage has, in marriage, there's a mutual servitude that the husband and wife express to each other that dance mirrors. The husband submits himself to his wife by serving her and providing her with livelihood and a house, a means to live well. The woman, while she does submit to her husband, she allows him to submit to her by allowing him to serve her and thus express his love for her. This mutual servitude is reflected in dancing as the man and the woman interact with each other as equals, both meeting each other's needs where their own abilities fall short, making the dance capable of expressing this relationship. Communication is vitally important for both a dance and a marriage to succeed. Without it, they are not able to become expressions of what is beautiful. So we have our definition, we examined the biblical evidence, looked at why people say dancing is bad, and how to take their arguments in context with their times. We've also looked at several of the goods of dancing, how it's a measure of social health. It helps one cultivate the virtues, and it provides a unique expression of the relationship between men and women. Despite dance being able to produce these goods, it is often corrupted. And we see that in our society very prevalently today. But just because dancing is corrupted does not mean that it should be shunned. Lumen Gentium from Vatican II states, quote, "The laity by their very vocation seek the kingdom of God by engaging in temporal affairs and by ordering them according to the plan of God." Running away from the problem is not going to solve it. Rather, we as Catholics not only can, but should participate in dancing, so we can take this activity out of the perverted hands into which it has fallen and restore it back to an expression that is worthy of the true, the good, and the beautiful. Thank you.
Members, thank you very much. I will turn to my fellow panel members for questions.
Thanks, Everest. You asserted dancing can be done well or poorly. Is that something you made an argument? Did you make that an argument for that, or is that just an assertion?
That is something that I kind of make as an assertion here, partially because there are a lot of real world examples of it, that dancing is done well or poorly. I do argue more about that in my thesis, but dancing can be done well or poorly. There are certain styles of dance that lend themselves to being corrupted more, or are themselves.
I guess I'm more
inherent.
interested in the well part.
The well part? Okay.
Yeah. So what's the argument that dancing can be done well?
So when dancing being done well is when it fits in with these proper ends of dancing. It does not being used as something to merely satiate somebody's desires. It's where there is an expression of an order between the man and the woman and the music. It causes someone to look at it and say, oh, that is something beautiful. That is something I want to take part in.
Just for clarification, does well in that context imply morally legitimate, or is it well in the sense that burglary can be done well or poorly?
Well, as in morally acceptable. It's something that is not going to cause one to sin while doing it.
Interesting.
That is a very common claim that particularly modern critics have, that no matter what one does while dancing, it is automatically a sin.
So what again was the argument that it can be done well?
When it is done well, it is an expression of something beautiful in a virtuous way that someone either in the dance or outside of it will be able to look at and see an order in it. That
It feels a little bit like you're begging the question, though.
Okay.
By saying that it's done well when it's done virtuously.
Okay, so do you want like a specific example?
I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm wondering, can it be done virtuously?
I mean, that's kind of why I asked what I did about the meaning, right? In other words, there actually can be an admirable order in acts that are bad. And it's reasonable to describe it as doing it well. That is, in fact, what's going on. That's why we like heist movies. That is not because there's a moral action taking place, because there's something to admire in an immoral action frequently. And
Okay.
Because that's what. So could it be done well in that sense? As well as asking.
So that dancing, even though it would be an immoral activity, is still being done well?
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're asking?
It seems to me there are lots of acts about which that is true to us. So.
Okay. I think I would argue that dancing is a moral activity, not an immoral activity, for the reasons that I talked about here. in that it reveals something about a culture's moral state. It habituates one in the virtues. It provides a revelation of the relationship between men and women. So I don't think that dancing is necessarily an immoral activity that is being used to express something well. I do think that it actually helps one. The principle end would be growing in virtue. I'm not entirely sure how an immoral action would help one to grow in virtue. And since dancing can do that, I think that it is a moral activity that, when it is done well, will demonstrate this growth in virtue in the people that partake in it.
Okay. To Vianney for a second.
Okay.
Do you really think? What do you think? Tell me. Do you really think he would look at our dances and say that they were good?
There are a lot of dances that he most definitely would look at and say those are bad, and I would agree with him on that. I do not disagree with his arguments. What I do disagree with is when others take his arguments as claiming something that goes beyond the scope of what his arguments are capable of being applied to, namely that all dancing is bad and immoral.
So how would we apply his standard to our dancing to decide whether or not it was good or bad? I guess if we want to keep the couples out of the hedges, apparently.
Yes. So that is where going through the proper circumstances would play a really important role. You'd want to make sure that, let me back up a little bit. A lot of the dances done at his time that he saw were done very late at night, were already accentuated by a lack of moral integrity in the people, and were more or less just cases where people would go meet each other and then go off into the hedges. I think if one were to take out those bad components, make it a little bit earlier in the day, ensure that the people who are there actually have a foundation in virtue, like the way that we have it here. There's all of us are Catholic, we live virtuous lives, and when we dance, that is a reflection of that. I think once those circumstances are ordered towards something that is actually good, he would be more willing to say that dancing is okay, provided that the type of dancing done as well actually befits someone who is a Christian. I think that once those pieces were brought back into the order which they should be in, he would look at it and say, okay, yes, this is something that can be done well.
I'm not sure if that really helped.
Okay.
I heard, don't dance late at night.
Mm-hmm.
Don't have sinners there. Which seems like we're batting 0 out of 2 so far. And then something about the particular dance.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't ask him what he thought about swing dance.
Correct.
So what am I supposed to do with swing dance?
So
I know that I'm not supposed to do the beret.
Mm-hmm. Ultimately, for deciding whether or not a specific dance style ought to be participated in, you need to make sure that it aligns with the definition that I laid out earlier, which are mostly comprehensive, but they are definitely not complete definitions for it. But the dance style, and you look at it, you be like, okay, are these actions something that are appropriate? Like, are they sexually provocative? Are they just moving your feet in a certain way in time with the music? Do the ways that the partners hold each other, are they very physically proximate? Does the emotion that the dance and the music are trying to express, is that something good, or is it trying to just inflame one in a certain direction through the actions, through the way that the entire dance is orchestrated? So it comes down to a really case-by-case basis, where there's a broad spectrum that dances can fall on based on how many of these criteria they meet, the degree to which the criteria are either violated or followed. So it's ultimately, there can't be like a definitive statement of, oh, swing dancing is good, because it can be done in a way that promotes vice or in a like very immoral manner.
Okay, I'll just ask one more question.
Okay,
You ended by saying we should dance.
correct.
Was that just like a rhetorical flourish, or did you mean that?
No, I think we should.
Why aren't other people telling us that?
Why haven't other people?
Yeah, like why isn't the church telling us that? Like why isn't there an encyclical that says this is important, you should dance?
I think the reason being is that it hasn't been a great enough issue to merit that. Most of the writing on dancing has been done either by saints or early church fathers, theologians, but nothing really above that. The closest that the church has come to making a definitive statement on dancing was in 1916, followed by another decree in 1918, both from some councils of Baltimore, where they said primarily that priests and other religious should not participate in dances, and that the dances as at present carried on should not be participated in, but they did not make any definitive statements on it. And so I think the reason why people haven't been told that they should dance is simply because this issue is only now becoming more relevant. There's been a lot of pro-dance, anti-dance arguments from everybody from like bloggers to YouTubers talking about why dancing is good or why dancing is bad. So I just don't think it had the moral weight that would have merited something definitive from the church.
I think there was. Do you think are any of the dances that we do morally corrupt or at least suspect? Or are they all good?
Here at WCC, I think the majority of them are morally sound.
What's in the minority?
The minority is a very unpopular opinion, and it is not necessarily immoral, but it is definitely not, I don't think, like a good form of dancing, and that would be like mosh pit dancing or raving, simply because it is not an expression of the beautiful. It is mostly just a release of pent-up emotion, and it really appeals to the more baser side of our nature, the more animalistic side of our nature, and doesn't really help us grow in virtue, become better humans. It just allows us to like release energy. But the majority of other ones that we do, such as swing dancing, waltzing, contra dancing, I think those ones are done well here. Partially because most of the student body knows how to dance well and have been formed in virtue. And so their actions will reflect that on the dance floor.
Okay. That's interesting because pretty much or a lot of the criticisms, both the ones cited here and ones I've seen elsewhere, and even the comment about priests not dancing, seem to be drawn from this idea there's an intrinsically sexual tendency in dancing. But if that's the case, it would seem that things like, even break dancing are going to be the best type.
Because
so
they're single.
They're least prone to that. If they're just some individual doing his thing, like David before the ark. Would that be fair, or is there something wrong with that?
Since I didn't talk much about dances that are done either by one person at a time or like single sex dances, I'm not entirely sure where the distinction lies. But regarding like the sexual nature of couples dancing together. If you wanted to avoid like sexual sins, I guess, from dancing with somebody of the opposite sex, then yes, dances that are done by oneself would be better.
Great. Do you know of any passages where St. John Vianney actually makes any concessions like that, where like he recommends the minuet, as Dr. Kwasniewski says, or says that, well, some dances are okay, but not the ones you're doing?
No, he, in the writings that I've read of him, does not make many exceptions to what he's saying. I think partially because he was dealing with local people, the common people. He wasn't as involved in the nobility as St. Francis of Sales was, where he would have seen more of these, I guess, exotic kinds of dancing, not in the sense that we use it now, but just like variations and adaptations. And since St. John Vianney was writing to his town, his concern was for the souls of his parishioners. And since he sees them participating in this activity, which is causing them to fall into sin, he is trying to prevent them from doing that so that way they can actually live a virtuous life.
Yeah, I guess my concern is this: I compare a response like the one you're giving to the kinds of things he actually says, it's hard not to suspect that we're not just taking advantage of the fact that he's not here to defend himself, to totally ignore what he actually wants to say to us.
Okay.
I mean, it seems much more aggressive than the kind of thing that, say, Dr. Kwasniewski is saying, which sort of tries to make it sound something similar to what you're saying, as if St. John Vianney would totally have been okay if he saw WCC dances. And based on everything he says, I find that very doubtful. It's hard for me to believe it.
Okay.
Maybe to build on that a little bit, I have a kind of meta question about this whole discussion.
Okay.
Which is, yeah, when I read things like his sermons on dancing, which are, again, pretty fiery.
Yes.
If I don't know, if I can brush it off as easily as your oration makes it sound like I should be able to brush it off, I kind of wonder what's left with respect to our attitude of taking the saints as our teachers. Can we really do that if it's so easy to brush them off by saying whatever, dude? Which is what it feels like to me.
Okay. That's not what I'm trying to go for. I'm not trying to say just ignore the saints because their writings are specific to their time frame. What I'm trying to get across is that the saints do have valid arguments. St. John Vianney is 100% correct in saying that these immoral dances should be avoided, but that his arguments should not be taken out of context, because a lot of the sources that I found while researching my thesis and oration, a lot of them just took his writings and said, a saint said this, provided no clarifying information whatsoever, and then used it as a proof that dancing was bad. So I'm not trying to dismiss the saints or their arguments as of teachers. They do have a lot of good to say, but when it comes to something like this, which doesn't have a definitive teaching by the church, we do need to take into account like where they're coming from, what they're seeing, why they're writing what they're writing.
Great, thank you.
Most of my questions were covered, so we'll open it to the audience.
Oh boy, that's a lot of questions. Yuri.
I was wondering, thanks for the oration, by the way, very good. So you covered a few types of dances specifically in your oration. And as far as I'm aware, during your research, you looked into a lot of different types of dances, ethnic dances included. And I was wondering, are there any types you come across that would be safe to completely cordon off as immoral and unreasonable to do in any circumstance?
Ethnic dance or just dancing in general?
Just dancing in general.
Any that I would cordon off. I think one of the most obvious ones, which basically fulfills the basic definition of dancing, would be like grinding or other sorts of dancing that are designed to sexually arouse the other person, I would say that those ones are probably safely avoided, simply because they have a great tendency towards temptation. Otherwise, I think that when determining which types of dance to participate in, you have to look at like how easily it would be corrupted, how easy it would be for it to be corrupted, how easy it could cause you to fall into sin, as kind of a general rubric. But there were none that I found that like were definitively no, don't do this type of dancing. I will say, on that note, the church did formally condemn 3 types of dancing specifically, and that was the polka, the waltz, and the tango. For the polka and the waltz, they have developed a little bit, and the arguments that were used to condemn them are not as applicable now. It's kind of a weird, squishy situation where it's not entirely clear if the church still holds that they are condemned or not. But as far as the tango is concerned, I am pretty sure that the church has still maintained that position in its writings, even though it might seem otherwise. Other than that, there's not really a
Where
definitive.
has the church done that? And
That
that
was-
seems like very important information to withhold until the Q&A.
I wanted to talk about it, but it was because of time. I
Okay.
didn't have time to put it in.
So in what way did the church condemn that?
So the reason why the church condemned the tango was because of its very sexual nature.
When you say the church, you mean like,
What
what does that mean?
this would be the, I believe, 10th Plenary Council of Baltimore, I believe, condemned it. I don't know if it was then taken as a worldwide condemnation or if it was specific to the United States. But I guess a brief aside on that is that the United States is the only country that has ever had certain art has had articles published or proclaimed to it regarding dancing. The other countries have not. They're very US specific. But they banned the tango because of the inherent sexual nature of it and the proximate vicinity of the dancers to themselves and the types of motions that the dancers were doing, along with the intent that it had of like being very romantic. Yes, Dr. Brown.
Sorry, I heard a very strong reaction to that. If we're saying something like, let's learn the waltz, guys, it's not clear whether the arguments the church used when she condemned are still applicable. What are we even doing?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, that bothers me a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So the reason given by the church for condemning the waltz and the polka was that they were done very quickly and they involved what was called the indecent position. The indecent position was basically where, rather than how we do it today, where the man and the woman have their hands like this, and the man has a hand on the back of her shoulder blade, and the woman has her hand on his shoulder, and then they do the step. The indecent position, the person had their fingers interlaced out here, and the man had his hand around her waist, so they were quite literally completely in full frontal contact, like legs intertwining as they ran around the dance floor in time to the music. And that is why I say that it is kind of like not nebulous, but unclear as whether or not that would still hold, because the dancing has changed so that now the dancers are farther apart. It is done in a more slower fashion. It's like, I don't think like, the morals of the church are changing when they write on this. I think that the dancing is what is changing. And that's what makes it difficult. Not that the church's decisions are being questioned, but that the dancing is changing as such as making, okay, does this still fall under that decree? Liam.
Thank you for your iteration, Everest. What you were saying in the end about the sort of multiplicity of men and women kind of joining together into like one unity as they dance.
Mhm.
It reminded me a lot of something Father David was telling us in theology about the Trinity, when he said it could also be compared to a sort of dance that they do. And I was wondering, in that reflection of the mystery of the Trinity, could you then say that dance could be a form of praise? Like, obviously, I do not want liturgical dance in church.
Okay.
Like, is there an aspect of dance that you could consider like praise and things like that?
I think there could be, in the fact that we are using what God has given us to express something beautiful about the world, about our relationship with each other, but doing it like directly as Thanksgiving, like saying, okay, I am dancing in thanks to God, like, or let's say, I am swing dancing in thanks to God for making it so my dog came out of surgery well. Like, I really wanted him to come out of surgery alive and healthy. He did, so I'm gonna swing dance in Thanksgiving for it. I don't think that would be the correct way in which it would be able to be expressed as Thanksgiving, but it is kind of, I guess you could have a more implicit understanding of you are using what he has given you to express Thanksgiving for what he has done, but not in this, oh, I'm going to do this action as thanks or in praise of something he has done. Austin.
Thank you very much. So in competitive dancing,
Mhm.
dances aren't always done with the purpose of like, forming virtue.
Mhm.
They're actually intended to evoke maybe not a perverted emotion out of judges, but they are intended solely for the purpose of evoking emotion of maybe wonder from the judges, is this still a moral kind of dancing where they might not necessarily be done for the purpose of like a more complete unity between man and woman, and because it's being done for the purpose of evoking emotion.
What sort of emotion is being, like, is it an emotion that is like good where they're not going to be tempted, or is it something like where they're doing something that is going to cause people to like lust after them or look at them, the dancers, in a more sexual manner? Because if that is the case, then I would say no, because it's being used to go after something that is not good, that is sinful. But if the dancing is done to evoke wonder, then I think that it would naturally follow that the complementarity between men and women would follow from that, because that would be a very great expression of how they are working together to achieve whatever move or step it is that they're trying to do. Does that make sense? Okay. Ethan.
So Liam didn't want to go there, but I'll go there.
Okay.
And I know this is outside the scope of your thesis.
Lovely.
But so you talked about dancing as expressing beauty, expressing the truth about human nature, inculcating the virtues and probably expressing them as well. As such, it seems to be one of the most liturgical arts. So is there a reason why we wouldn't incorporate it into the liturgy itself? Maybe during the offertory we could dance the gifts up as a kind of expression of our thanks for the gifts of the earth and bring them to God.
So I don't think we should, simply because simply because even though dancing is capable of those goods, in and of itself, it is still a lesser good than the liturgy. And I think that it would end up distracting people from the good that is the liturgy, where at that point you're taking a lower good and putting it in communion with, so to speak, a higher good, which I don't think would end up reflecting the full intent of what that lesser good is trying to do towards the greater good in the liturgy. And so it should probably be left out because of that. Hope.
Can you compare Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake to Stravinsky's Rite of Spring? And
Hey, like music.
although you said you don't delve into a lot of single
Mhm.
dancing, both can they both are performed at a high caliber
Mhm.
and performed in accord with the intention of the artist Tchaikovsky and Stravinsky, but also the choreographers.
Mhm.
And they both have their own kinds of beauty to
Mhm.
them, but they're both strikingly different.
And just like comparing them as like morally comparing them.
I would morally and the level of skill.
Morality and the level of skill. So morally, since I have only seen one, I would be hard pressed to make a definitive answer for. I will say that something to keep in mind is that there's an author that we used to read for music. It was called A Different Drummer by Michael Platt. And in it, he says that as music expresses the soul of the dancer reflects the soul of the music. So I think ultimately, if you're going to determine the morality of something that is supposed to be a reflection of a certain piece of music, as the piece of music, then you'd have to look further back into the music to see whether it is good or bad, which I do not know enough about to make a definitive statement on. So I would just say keep that in mind while doing it. And then regarding skill level, not entirely sure what you mean.
In both ballets, they are done by very skilled and very elite dancers.
Okay.
In Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake, it's more traditional Russian ballet. But
Okay.
in Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, we have kind of a reflection of your definition of immoral dance.
Okay.
But as a dancer myself, I look at that dance and see it as beautiful because I can see a part of the choreographer's intention, and the ballerina is able to dance it perfectly in accord with
What
the
they want.
choreographer's intention. And
Okay.
And the dancer is also able to, as you say, evoke the emotion that
the music
the
is trying
song
to.
music also has.
Okay. So you're asking for a comparison between looking at it as a skill-based comparison versus a moral comparison and how those two align.
Yes.
So with the moral comparison, as I mentioned earlier, you'd have to follow the criteria for like saying, okay, is this going to lead me to temptation? Are what they are doing bad? But as Dr. Bolin mentioned earlier about how there can be something that is done immorally still being an expression of something that is good, like the example that he gave of a burglar committing theft well, I think that this would be an instance of that where even if it is immoral, the skill level of the dancers is still something to be admired. Like it is not demeaning to what they can do, but what they are doing falls under the moral scrutiny. not necessarily that they can do it. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much.